This conference will now be recorded.
Howdy all. My name is Copeland, and I'm going to be presenting. It's not as much of a product as much of it is more of a service or kind of an inquiry. I connected back from my learning experiences now back to my previous profession in education. I spent the last several years explicitly working with teacher teams and math teams and campus teams on trying to improve practices. And in this educational society that we're in, where standardized testing, excuse me, I should speak closer, where standardized testing is so much a part of the system. I've really had a loud voice in the places where I've worked in how do we respond to test and test data more effectively rather than just taking it kind of as this two-dimensional spreadsheet and not really do anything with it. So it's something I'm passionate about because of my background in education. So I just called this Beyond Content because I could see in the future where something I'd be interested in doing would be acting as more of a consultant for educational systems, either campuses or admin teams. Well, that's a little bit of my background. Wanted to be explicit and just letting you know that this is my push has never been about test scores. It's never about just trying to up that score, but what it is about is trying to create a more enriching learner experience. So this focus is on trying to understand connections explicitly so we can ask better questions and have better follow-up action in response to data that we're looking at. Give you a minute to read over that. And I have a few of those lines I call my pull strings, the things that I've always said over and over again, like those little pull string dolls. So I think that whenever we are investigating data, whenever we are looking into anything, being very responsible with it, it should allow us to ask better questions, which should give us more valuable conversations all about future decision making. That's really what data is for. Data is always about looking forward. It's never just about looking backwards. And it's important that you also understand a little bit of my background. So I currently describe myself with these layers of learning. I was a mathematician by nature, mathematician at heart. I took my mathematics and I was able to find a place in education. That's where I grew as an adult and professionally. Got my master's program in cognitive neuroscience, which was really applying the science of the brain and learning into the field that I was passionate about, education. Through my roles, I acquired some very specific leadership experience, leadership learning, and of course my most recent layer is data science. So I want you to understand the lens through which I kind of perceive information, and that really gauges my decision making and why I argue certain directions. This is not from this particular project, but this is a very, very simple example of how digging into some data, looking for insights, can give us a better perception of a situation and let us react and deliver our decisions in a more productive way. So I'm going to go for some audience participation here. 5G3 it's a math standard. It's a 5th grade math standard. It's just about dividing decimals. So students took a test. This test had some test questions on this topic, and that's what we get as a result. So we have an initial response to that. We have an impulsive reaction. Oh, that sounds terrible. How would you feel if your students had that performance level? Not very happy about it. We would be upset. But if we dig in just for a little bit more insight, we just go one layer deeper, we get more specific results, and it changes the storyline a little bit, changes our perception, but most importantly, it changes our action, our follow-up action. So how would you feel about this data compared to the first one? Anybody want to throw anything out there?
The strengths and weaknesses.
Strengths and weaknesses, but it's the same topic. So initially we might think, oh my goodness, these kids are not masters of multiplying or of dividing decimals. We need to go practice dividing decimals. But now we've got evidence that says, well, apparently they can divide decimals. So there's something else at play. There are other variables or other factors in there. So it's not just the math content itself. There's other influences that are going to determine success. And then we could even take it a step further, go into more insight, dig down a little bit further into data, and we can look at wrong answer distribution. This tells even a more of a richer story. So it's through this lens that I kind of approach data when I'm trying to figure out how are we going to use this information to figure out what we're going to do next, rather than just falling into the old routines of The test scores weren't great. I guess I just need to go practice division. Now, this story isn't just go practice division. We clearly can divide if that problem says just divide, but there's more to these problems. There's more to these items. So that was kind of the context of where I wanted to explore this test data. So here's my test data set. It's based on the 2019 sixth grade math STAR data. Along the way, I'm going to point out some limitations in my project, and this is a great place to point out the first limitation. Just like a research project, no matter what conclusions I may or may not get to, it's only going to represent this single test, this specific population at this moment in time. There's no larger story. So the limitation is it's just sixth grade. It's just a math test, and it's one single math test. The math tests change every single year. So in extensions from our projects, where I would go if I was going to continue this further, I would like to pull in math tests from multiple years and see if I can detect trends and see patterns along the way, or get more cumulative impacts rather than just this one snapshot in time. The data I chose is under 4 basic categories. So there's demographic data, just student identification stuff. Then there's math topics. So all like that math standard was division of decimals, but it falls into 4 umbrella categories. So I brought in the 4 umbrella categories. Then there's the item analysis. There were 38 questions on this test, and then the overall performance, which was separated into a raw score and some performance level indicators. Started out with over 400,000 rows of data, and I got it whittled down to just over 300,000. In reflection, if I had done this project differently, I would have been a lot more specific in my focus, and I would have gone down to far less than 300,000. I worked really, really, really hard to salvage as much data along the way as I was, just filtering out, cutting out, trimming everything I could. There were no values inside of subcategories. So a category within a category, I was drilling down really deep, and I worked really hard to try and salvage the full data sets as much as I could, rather than taking out large chunks. That was problematic, but it was very beneficial as far as my learning curve. And I did keep 28 rows, which is also a lot of features. As I already said, if I was going to do this again, I would have been more specific in my focus. Along the way, I did accomplish some basic models. K&N classification is what I used because there were so many different features, and my exploration was broad. I didn't get to spend as much time really drilling into the specific demographics or the specific distribution of results. So the one on the left, that's from the reporting categories. So the reporting categories, and sorry, I didn't illustrate that clearly. There are 4 reporting categories that point directly to the overall performance. Well, of course, how you do on the individual categories is going to be a strong influence on how you do overall in the test. So on these 4 categories, the result of the accuracy is almost 100%, because if you do well on the subcategories, you're going to do well on the overall test. And also there's strong correlation, so there's heavy redundancy in the reporting categories, because if you do well in one math category, you're likely going to do well in another math category. So it was redundant, but those were some of my initial kind of proof of concepts when I was running through my code, running through my processes. The second set is from demographic data. So that doesn't contain any data regarding performance on the test. It's just gender information, ethnicity information, whether the students were labeled as either receiving special education services or being enrolled in gifted talented. There's language proficiency, so for English language learners. Purely based on demographic data, there was a baseline of a 38% accuracy. That's really where I was trying to explore some of the featurization, trying to find out which combinations. But due to time and due to how much work it was to get down to the data itself, I didn't get to explore and have any of those eureka moments. But I wasn't expecting anything more than about 50%, because again, if there's nothing pointing at the test performance, it's just on identification. With a population as big as 300,000 records of data across Texas, you're going to have, whether you're looking at boys that have an Asian ethnicity and receiving whatever labels or whatever accommodations, you're going to have enough examples on the high end and the low end that you're going to get a lot of washout from that. So I think the real value to providing this level of inquiry isn't at the looking at the data in a Texas scope. It would be specifically working with like Arlington School District or working with Waco School District, finding a very specific region where their demographics probably had I don't know the best way to say that is, it wouldn't match up to the average for the whole state, where again, your highs and your lows just kind of average out. What I know from my domain experience, from my years in education, is you are going to have specific trends within smaller regions or within smaller school systems. I think that's really insightful, because that's where the action will actually be happening anyways. Because if I am working with a Denton ISD or an Irving ISD, they don't really care about how all of Texas did. What they want to know is how their students did. So both of these metrics, especially the one on the right, it's just interesting because it's statewide. It's only really impactful and action available when you're looking at it on smaller subsets. So measuring student performance, and I'm sorry, I think I got my slides switched. I should have had this one first. On your overall performance, it was based on a raw score. Now, depending on how many of those questions you got right out of 38, you were in one of 4 categories. You either mastered expectations, you met expectations. If you didn't meet expectations, but you were doing okay, they have a category called approaching expectations. And then of course, below that is just low expectations. So I use those 4 categories to do a categorical regression model, not a linear regression. So I wasn't actually trying to project onto the score. I was trying to predict identification on that level. And you can see it's a pretty big distribution. A pretty balanced, uniform distribution overall. Sorry, I got those slides out of order. That would have made more sense before the other one. All right, now we get into some more fun stuff, and this is a lot of numbers on the screen. In my years of working in education, you throw a lot of numbers on the screen. It turns out most people in the audience, but I was not able to get my heat map working for this. But I did want to put this up on the screen because what it does show that as I picked and chose out of some of the demographics, there is an impact, or there is not an impact, but there is a correlation with test performance. But a lot of the stuff at this level is it's well-duh correlations. Obviously, if you are from a socioeconomic disadvantaged label or perspective, you're not going to do as well, because we've discussed before about shortcomings in educational opportunities. And if you're identified as gifted and talented, you're going to have a stronger test performance. So this is just information. This is more proof of concept here. In an extension of my project, I would love to be able to drill down deeper. But what I do really like talking about is all the other things that I would like to accomplish with a project like this. Because of my passion for it, my brain was trying to answer far too many questions, but I have a lot of big ideas as far as what I could do with this, or what I think would be valuable to a lot of people in educational systems. And again, don't necessarily read this. I don't read slides out loud, but I want to give you all a chance to look over those questions that popped in my head.
So, Case, to what degree does question design account for portion of student error?
Excellent question. That's actually one of the topics that, from my previous roles, that's a conversation I continually had to have that most people in education, most people specifically in math education, don't engage in. So just like when we looked at that initial data model, the topic was dividing decimals, division with decimals. But you can ask that question in a lot of different ways. You can ask those in real world context. You can ask those in explicit, here's a division problem, solve it. You can also ask that where it's not a solution-oriented problem, it's some sort of visual representation of the task. So there's so many different ways you can approach content. And what I have found in my experience is that the way you ask questions is often just as powerful, if not more powerful, as far as expectation of outcomes or student performance than the actual math content itself. So there's a big demand and understanding that we need to ask questions in a lot of different ways so that a student can show mastery in different ways, or especially if the student can just show mastery in one way, we want to provide them opportunity to be able to show that they do have some understanding rather than just here's a problem, solve it. So to that one, I think that we need to really understand that the way that we engage the learner has a big impact on how we perceive their success levels. And a lot of my further inquiries are really heavy in how we wordsmith our questions as well. The biggest tool that I would want to connect to the project like this in a phase 2 or an extension would be some natural language processing, because we purposefully write standardized test questions above the Lexile age level that they're written for. So the age range, the Lexile level for a 6th grade math test will include questions written from like a 4th grade level all the way up to an 8th grade level. And this is very discouraging, and that's a round conversation. It's a round conversation because there's no beginning and no end to it. It just is what it is. So I think implementing some sort of understanding of metrics on how the language per item has an impact on performance, I think that would be really insightful. Everything from the register to the explicit word use to the word count. And that's not just for English language learners, that's also for just low performing readers as well.
Sure. I think you have a lot of opportunity with I shared this with you, knowledge graphs, knowledge mining, the whole, if you start to think about how does knowledge evolve and what are the contemporary techniques for question design and where are these types of questions being designed. If you had access to the universe, which is every country and their design techniques and where their questions are going in terms of design, and have access to those, you can see over time, how does your district adopt or accept some of those design criteria into whatever math or science or English. Right? So you have knowledge mining, graph theory, probability theory, time series analysis combined together can give you a projection of where the next type of question design would come.
Right. Well, and to piggyback on that a little bit, what's also really interesting to me, given this data set and given how I'm explicitly interested in the quality and the types of the questions, more so than I am the answers themselves. What's also a factor that we have to consider is how the tests change over time, because standardized testing is a big business, and you brought up international education. So the standardization of education and the standardized testing, that's a really American phenomenon. That's not a global norm, if you will. So in order to stay relevant, these companies that are selling their major tests are constantly evolving their test. Now, the way that states used to create their test before they hired out third parties and just bought these as testing packages is they would throw out an invitation to all the math teachers in Texas and say, all the math teachers, if you would like to participate, you can submit these test questions. So what you often had is a group of very ambitious, very enthusiastic math teachers competing to get their test question chosen. The way that manifests is explicitly more complex questions than what would normally be used in a classroom engaging environment, because they're trying to make their questions unique. And then after you've done that for a few years and there's a sample set of, oh, this is how they're going to ask questions on dividing decimals, you have to continually stay ahead of the curve as far as making the question unique and engaging. I call it the hamburger phenomenon, because so many years ago, a good hamburger used to be a pretty basic, meat and patty, lettuce and tomato. But nowadays, in order to stay ahead of the curve, hamburgers had to continually get more complex and more creative and more kind of out there. And it's exciting for us, but if we treat math questions the same way, that means we're constantly keeping the learners in a stage of discomfort, only to satisfy kind of the adult element in the room. So I think when you look at standardized math tests over time, if I could compare 2019 to the past 3 or 4 years, we would see some trends and some norms. But if we were to compare that to 5 to 10 years ago, we would see a lot of different, especially language distribution in those. So that's where I would really love to put some sort of metrics on the language demand in the math items. So one of the other limitations I wanted to be very clear about is my original intention was to identify which questions out of these 38 questions were the most impactful in predicting student performance. I didn't get to that, obviously, because of the demand of everything else I was working on. But even if I had, I was short-sighted in my selection, because even though they released the student data, they have not released the 2019 test. So even if I had discovered that question number 5 and question number 27 were these really significant items, I don't actually have access to the test yet. Those won't come out till this fall. So if I could extend it, I could then take those items out, and then we could have that very valuable discussion. Let's say we identified question 5, 27, and 33 and said these questions tended to be highly weighted as far as predicting student outcomes. I'm trying not to be negative. The short-sighted approach to that most school districts fall into, because school districts exist in a state of firefighting. It's constantly battling whatever is on the table. But when you look at data, you're trying to get out of the reactionary mode into a proactive mode for addressing that. So if you can identify those 3 questions, the impulsive reaction is, wow, let's go find a whole lot of questions that look just like these 3 questions and practice, practice, practice. But again, I think that's misdirected. What you should do is take those 3 questions, then break down a further analysis. What do these questions have in common? What is it about the design of these questions that is such a gatekeeper for performance levels? I think those are really the valuable questions and the valuable decision-making opportunities you get into when you're digging for insights. Some tangent projects. Some of these I just talked about a little bit. When you're looking at correct and incorrect, that's also a little bit short-sighted as far as what you can engage in, because wrong answer distribution is very, very meaningful, especially when you're looking at not necessarily the top performers, but what if you're trying to find out what were the questions that kept those people just under expectations from meeting expectations. A couple of wrong answer distributions, you can look at this question, the evidence indicates that it's not random guessing. This question indicates that people chose answer C, which was wrong, but they chose it for a reason. Then you get to explore, are there some metrics, or is there something about the language? Are there baits in that are highly valuable that we could explore? And what we do with that is, how do we convert that into more of a engaging learner opportunity all throughout all the classroom experiences, all throughout our homeworks, so it's not just about applying this into a test scenario, it's how do we transform our learning environments to mimic greater learner outcomes by that level of engagement. Another tangent project that I could connect to this, the second one, is again what we talked about a second ago, is exploring different item types. So over time, on any single math test, I might only have 1 or 2 questions on a topic. But if I had 10 different math tests, I'm going to get a lot more of a distribution of the types of ways we could ask questions on the same topic. I think those are really valuable insights. If we could throw all those up onto a wall, do an NLP just on those, I assume that would offer some very telling insight that could help us make better decisions as far as engaging the learners in growth opportunities while they're going through the learning experience, not just on the test environment. Here's some more of what's possible. And I present this slide explicitly through the context of if I was talking to a school district, and if I was brought in as some sort of consultant that isn't just analyzing data for them, but also acting in a manner that offers professional development, who's training and trying to grow their teacher talent, their teacher decision making as well. I want them to know that if we really got into all of your student data, there's a lot that we could do that could affect not just your instruction, but your curriculum design as well, and how you set out your curriculum schedule, your calendar, and even how we treat the language learners in the room as well. So there's a lot of what's possible when you're really digging for insights to affect your decisions rather than just reaction as far as wanting to put a grade on a paper. Now, what I learned, I'll spare you the long list of what I learned in Python in my last several days, but here are some big picture concepts that I did learn going through this. Sitting in a room with other people who are working through their projects, there's a lot of interaction at the developmental stage, and I don't mean internal development, I mean in your project development, where you're taking some feedback from other people and you're seeing what somebody did on something else. Because of distribution of skills and distribution of strengths, working in cooperative teams is always going to get you far more robust projects and probably greater insight, because you're going to be able to get feedback from other people who have obviously a view that's outside of the lens that you're seeing things through. Clearly, I have a lot of what's possible and a lot of passion for this. I think authentic interest drives how good our project comes out to be. That's why explicitly my interest in data science has never been about, ooh, I wonder what big major company wants to hire me to come look at their data. I'm much more interested in how the availability of all these tools are going to revolutionize people's personal projects in these fields that they're already in. And then, as I've said before, one of my pain points, one of the things I would do differently is be a lot more precise in my setting a hypothesis and seeking to evaluate that hypothesis, rather than just saying, I'm really interested in this whole thing, let me see what happens. That's the end of that, but I did want to make sure I had everything else. Yep, I'm sorry, I covered all my limitations. I had a long list of limitations. I decided not to fill out 3 slides with that. Any specific questions as far as other intentions, what I possibly didn't get to? Yes, ma'am.
On the language learners?
Yes.
Were you able to decide or determine that 58,000 that did not meet expectations for the language learners?
It's a strong correlation. There's a lot of redundancy there. Again, because it's a standardized test written in very formal language, and it doesn't offer partial credit for kind of understanding something. Standardized tests are all about it's either A, B, C, or D. There's obviously there's all those statistical relationships that we already know are true regarding some ethnicity categories, socioeconomic status.
So when you are like testing the ESL, you're actually testing without someone to translate that.
You know,
are they testing straight in English?
I appreciate you asking that. It's something I didn't elaborate on a lot. When I started with 45 categories, a lot of the categories are filtering out who took which test because they do offer the math test in Spanish as well. And you also are, I'm sorry, not everybody. Students that are pegged with certain labels are allowed accommodations on test. So the 400-something thousand original records, those all are because there's that many sixth grade students in Texas. All the data sets that came in were based on bubbled in Scantron sheets. So you can imagine almost 500,000 Scantron sheets are bubbled in. There's going to be a lot of places where people misbubbled, a lot of situations where students who obviously are not in the school mood, they don't play school well. They sit there and they're sitting there in front of a test and they'll just put their pencil down and say, I'm not taking the test. The school is legally required to still submit a Scantron with no data in there. Now, because the test was submitted, that's not considered null data. Null data would be as if the student didn't take it at all. But this is a Scantron with all wrong answers, even though they're empty answers. So those had to be removed and filtered out painfully in different ways. But because of that, you do get a lot of null sets where a student might belong to a certain subcategory. So their data was not valid or it wasn't complete. So that addresses the 100,000 students that got removed.
So is there a mean that's added into that, that's factored in that?
You can report means in a lot of different ways, depending on how you want to present the story of that information. Anything that I looked into was explicitly complete set of data that I had connected with having a score outcome. Anything that wasn't complete just wasn't part of my investigation because it wouldn't have been reliable as far as indicating correlation. Larry?
So if you had more time, and I know you had your list of limitations, and let's say you just overcame it, what would be next for this?
The next was, I think my original focus, what I really wanted to accomplish was separating out the 38 questions and presenting the argument that if we're really just trying to assess whether a student mastered the set of grade level content, we don't really need 38 questions to determine mastery. I predict that on a very small subset, we can predict a student's performance level based on the specific most powerful questions. What I was interested in is which questions were the most impactful. So that would be the first thing that I would try to accomplish is that out of 38, which questions had the highest weights as far as predicting performance.
In case I remember, the whole data acquisition was challenging too.
Yes, I had to go through an information request, obviously with the state, and there's the time delay in that. Then you have to go back and forth whenever they have a public, an office that generates public information request. If you request too much, it takes 6 to 8 weeks and it costs money. So my original request was going to take me a couple months and $100. So my first level of filtering out data was just cutting back. I also initially wanted to look at 3rd grade and 6th grade to see if the trends might vary a little bit. Obviously, I was being very ambitious with that. So going through that exercise, I finally got the data to come in. And when the data came in, they delivered in files in a file format that I could not access because I was not part of their internal system. So there was a little bit of user error that I thought was my limitation, but no, that limitation was on them. They sent me the wrong files. So I did have to complete all of this in the last like 12 to 14 days.
Any other questions for us?
Yes, ma'am.
Hypothetically, when you get ready to present this data to state legislation and you say, hey, this is the argument and what the data states, why the approach taken to standardized testing needs to change? How would, like, was there any data that you saw that would help you make that?
Fantastic question. Another one of those round conversations. There's no beginning, no end to it. But to be very, very frank, I never would. Years ago, I was very interested at the legislative level trying to impact change at that higher level, and it's not going to happen. To be frank, education is a very big business, and there's a reason that a lot of these structures are in place. I am far more interested in providing information at a local level where classroom teachers, campus teams, and district leadership can make different decisions to create better environments. That's really where I see the best application is in trying to do things better on the small scale rather than fighting this uphill battle where they're not really asking for this question in the first place.
This resonated very personally as a
Yeah.
very, very.
So we will work with UTD and change the questions.
Please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.